Square Enix is really on a roll here. First, Final Fantasy VII Remake comes out, then 2 weeks later, Trials of Mana Remake drops. Originally, Trials of Mana was a game that was exclusive to Japan under the name Seiken Densetsu 3. You couldn't play it unless you got a fan translation, at least until it was released last year in the collection of Mana that included the first 3 classic Mana games: Trials of Mana, the prequel Secret of Mana, and the very first Mana game that started it all, Final Fantasy Adventure. It's been a busy year, but I did manage to get in one playthrough of the original Trials of Mana before I played through the remake, because I wanted to be able to see the differences and make comparisons. And now, after spending 36 hours on the remake and completing my 4th playthrough, I am ready. The remake has rebuilt the game from the ground up and further enhances it by adding various improvements to existing systems, gameplay, and the story. It really does the original game justice, and even exceeds it in many ways. This was something the Secret of Mana remake lacked, and the reason I didn't like its one-to-one formula. Trials of Mana is an action RPG, like most Mana games, so there is a lot of freedom when it comes to movement and control of the character. It feels very fluid and reactive to what I want to do. Being able to jump, though simple and is a staple of any action RPG, was something I really enjoyed doing in the game. It felt great, but it was useful too. Various environments and towns will have sparkly treasure in high places that you need to jump to get to, or you can jump off cliffs to get to other areas of the map faster. Various shortcuts were also added to levels and are another great addition to the remake. It makes it much quicker and easier to traverse levels that were already visited. The best example is at the Mana Sanctuary, where stairs can be extended that connect the Mana statues to the entrance. This was the place I would always come back to for class changes, so it was nice to have a path that went directly to the statues instead of having to zigzag around each time. The puzzles and dungeons are mostly the same as in Classic, but do have a bit of extra flavor added by taking advantage of its new 3D environment. Traps were added to levels to spice up dungeon exploration a bit, where it wasn't just walking around aimlessly in a maze. Fiery Gorge has flame traps that spit out fire in a timed manner, and if hit by it, would knock you into a magma pit and give the burn status ailment. Woods of Wandaria is another interesting level that has added some liquid poison pools that require some acrobatics to get through. The fluid controls not only help with avoiding the new traps, but it also helps combat feel better. In comparison to Classic, combat is worlds better in the remake. Basic and power attacks can be strung together to form a combo on the ground or in the air. Combos add another dimension to the complexity of combat, and isn't something that was done in Classic where there is only one type of attack. Other improvements have been made to existing combat systems to really bring out its full potential, such as how special attacks work. In Classic, attacking enemies will build up a meter called the CS gauge that's used to perform special attacks. Using a special attack will completely deplete the gauge because it would always use the strongest attack possible, which could be pretty annoying at times. If the gauge wasn't used, it would be lost after combat ends, which added on to the frustration. In the remake, it's much more robust. Attacking enemies will drop crystals that can be picked up to build the CS gauge, and it won't deplete after combat finishes if it's unused. Different special attacks can also be chosen instead of always defaulting to the strongest attack, which allows for more variety in combos and strategy. They were also pretty cool to see. These are small changes that I always take for granted in modern games, but really make a big difference. There was another problem with combat in Classic, and that is the pacing. With the way spells and skills worked, combat would come to a complete stop whenever they were used, ruining any fun I was having by making me watch a long animation. These stops can happen anywhere from 3 to 4 times per encounter, which became frustrating pretty quickly. The remake changed this in probably the best way possible. Not only do spellcasting and skills no longer freeze the screen, they're telegraphed. At least for enemies, they're telegraphed. Ally spells almost always hit because of their homing properties. The only time they miss is if the enemy is hyperactive and moves around a lot, which doesn't happen too often. With enemies, spells and skills will always be telegraphed with the red warning, so there is time to react and dodge, though there is also a timing to it too. Some attacks will follow the character around until the last second where the telegraph stops. This makes battles way more interactive and more engaging. I enjoyed this aspect of combat a lot. Bosses are a great example of how Trials of Mana takes advantage of this system. Each boss now has a DPS check where they begin to power up for a move. This becomes obvious when the large red AoE telegraph comes on screen. During this phase, the player has to either deal enough damage to the objects powering up the boss, or to the boss itself. If the check is completed, it will stun the boss, allowing for some free attacks. And if not, well, better get those healing items ready if you didn't get a game over. It adds an extra layer of tension to the boss fights and gives the same kind of feeling as fighting a raid boss in an MMORPG. Combat is amazing and has come a long way from what it was in Classic, but it's not without some faults. One issue that immediately comes to mind is the incredibly useless AI, and is definitely the most frustrating and worst part of combat. There are adjustments that can be made to set how aggressive and defensive they are, but they're not great. Overly aggressive AIs do not dodge, but overly defensive AIs don't attack. It's hard to find a good balance where they do what I want them to do. Even when I set Angela's AI to use all of her MP, she resorts to using physical attacks instead of casting spells. The game's difficulty actually comes from the AI being pretty bad at playing the game. When they do die, they die way too often, so it's not even worth bringing them back to life with a cup of wishes. Luckily, this only happens during boss fights, which are only a small part of the game, and not during regular trash mob encounters. Though after the first playthrough, it becomes less of a problem because they can get ridiculously overpowered, where enemies, including bosses, will typically die before they can do any real damage. This is because of the progression system that can really be taken advantage of. It's something I consider to be the best and most meaningful addition to Trials of Mana. Nothing makes a game feel more rewarding than having a strong character created through min-maxing their build. Well, I didn't really optimize my min-max build, but it was still really rewarding building up all 6 characters to level 99 and having them demolish everything. There are 2 progression systems that are closely intertwined that makes this possible, which are class and ability progression. Each time a character levels up, they will gain training points to be put into any of the 5 stats, which are Strength, Stamina, Intelligence, Spirit, and Luck. Each stat obviously makes a character stronger in certain ways, like Strength is for physical attacks, and Intelligence is for magical attacks. Abilities get unlocked once a certain threshold of a stat is met, and there are useful abilities associated with all stats. For instance, I would typically only pump Intelligence into Angela because she's a mage, but I need to put points in all the other stats to learn the rest of her spells. While this forces me to get useless stats in a character, I like how it makes me think about how I should build a character instead of just blindly putting everything into one place. Limits are placed on stats and the number of equipable abilities to really stress this point. These limits can be increased when a class change happens later in the game, once more milestones are met. This creates a situation where each class's power difference can really be felt because the limits are increased, allowing more stats to be added and additional abilities to be set. There are tons of combinations and abilities to choose from to fit the playstyle you want. Not only that, each class has different passives to further flesh out their role in a party and creates that amazing synergy between the classes. It really adds to the rewarding feeling of being a powerhouse. The cherry on top is the new light and dark tier 4 classes that have been added to the bonus chapter in the remake, which just further blows everything out of the water since it allows all stats to be maxed and all abilities to be learned. There is still a limit of 8 equipable abilities at one time, so I can't get too crazy. Still, characters can be made insanely powerful, and it always feels great to be able to make that OP character to show off. But I'm not quite there yet. Unfortunately, the game is already pretty easy, even on hard mode, so once the endgame is reached, it's basically a breeze at that point. Combat and general gameplay feel great with all the quality of life changes, but the main story doesn't offer many additions from its classic version that make a significant difference. The original story wasn't bad, and it's not bad when it's retold in the remake, but it definitely feels dated and not as developed as I would expect of games today. The game can be completed in roughly 14 hours or so on the first playthrough. It's relatively short and even shorter when you know where you're going and what to do. There aren't any side quests either, so it's just making your way from point A to point B in a linear fashion until you beat the game. The closest thing to a side quest is finding Little Cactus, one of the adorable side characters from Legend of Mana, who found its way into the remake to play hide and seek with you. Finding him a certain number of times will unlock rewards such as getting a random experience boost, so it's worthwhile to look for it. The game offers some slight deviation from its linear storytelling by having the story told in 3 variations, which is dependent on the first selected character. Angela and Duran share the same nemesis, Reese and Hawkeye, another pair, have a completely different nemesis, and Kevin and Charlotte are the remaining pair with another unique nemesis. The characters and their antagonists all have different backstories and dialogues, but the main flow of events will be the same, causing each replay to feel repetitive, even with the subtle differences. That said, I do like the characters. They were interesting enough for me to go through the game again 2 more times to see how they handled the task of saving the world and resolving their conflict with their nemesis. They're done well, and new improvements have also added a lot to their development. It was cool to be able to talk to your party members when visiting towns, something that couldn't be done in Classic. Most of this is just flavor dialogue, but sometimes they add some nice context to their character, such as Hawkeye saying he hit on Duran's aunt, and Duran being totally oblivious to this. More dialogue has been added in combat as well that adds more context to characters and their story, making them even more likable. The new chapter put at the end of the game is another nice addition that rounds out each of the characters well. It only included a small cutscene for each character, but it adds a lot of depth by giving more insight into their past and their relationship with certain characters. That said, the new chapter was subpar in all other aspects. The new boss wasn't difficult or interesting since the game didn't explain anything about her. She appears in some of the other Mana games, so it might hold more significance for people who are actually familiar with her. But for me, she is an enigma, so it was hard to form that connection. The last dungeon also felt repetitive with its reuse of assets from other parts of the game. It was very similar to the concept of the Mirage Palace, one of the 3 endgame dungeons in the original storyline, and didn't offer anything new or interesting to the bonus chapter. So it's your basic SNES story, but told with a new format with a little sprinkle at the end. Similarly, the music in the remake carries the same feeling as in Classic, which is really nice because the original soundtrack is amazing. Listening to all the tracks again as I play through the game evokes the same feelings I had when playing through Classic and really does it justice. Something I'm always happy to see is the option to use the original SNES tracks, which the remake has. Sometimes I want to listen to the retro versions because it gives me a sense of nostalgia of games back in the day, and it's always great to be able to have that option. Now that I'm being nostalgic and thinking about retro games, I'll always miss the amazing sprite work. For this reason, Trials of Mana in the Collection of Mana will always have a place on my shelf, and will be something I will go back to eventually. I will never grow tired of the pixel art style because of how well it does exaggerated facial expressions. It's harder to nail down that emotion with a small sprite when compared to that of a 3D model, but I think it's this setback that really draws out the charm of sprite work and creates some great moments that can't be replicated in the remake. But really, I'm glad Square Enix decided to do a remake of Trials of Mana. It's not just any regular old remake either. They spent the time and effort to really let the game shine for new and old players alike, and they nailed it. I honestly didn't expect to do more than 1, maybe 2 playthroughs to see how different villains play out, but I couldn't stop. It's nice to see this series is still holding strong even after what happened with Secret of Mana. I had a blast playing through it, and hope there will be more Mana games to come in the future.